Over 3,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, the cultures of Northern Europe developed complex societies with sophisticated technologies. For more than 1,000 years, the people of what is called the Nordic Bronze Age lived in small farming settlements throughout these fertile lowlands and islands, in timber houses that, for the ruling classes, could be enormous. Rivers flowed to the long coastlines of the Baltic and the North Sea, where these people conducted trading and raiding on their friends and enemies. They imported materials like wool for their clothing, and metals like gold that they made into jewellery, and tin and copper that they formed into tools and weapons. A common practice in this era was the burial of important people beneath barrows, along with special objects like swords and belt plates. These beautiful metal objects, and the decorations and designs on them, tell us what the people living in these coastal lands of the north found important. Things like boats, and the life-giving power of the sun. And one of the most valuable remnants of this culture is the petroglyphs they left behind on boulders, typically in coastal regions. These images were tapped and ground into the rock using hammerstones, creating shallow depressions. In modern times, these are often painted red or white so they can be seen. Unlike most of the surviving art from Bronze Age Europe, this rock art is often figurative, depicting people and animals and objects, often undertaking activities, which gives us the most incredible insights into this prehistoric world. I previously made a video on my channel about this subject, focusing on the rock art mainly in an area called Boerslaan, and especially on the many boat images and the figures holding weapons. Researchers believe these could be reenacting battle scenes, or more probably, the rites involved with masculine activities like travelling, trading and raiding. The images convey a way of life that most of us would recognise in the activities of the medieval Vikings. Many of the comments under this video drew attention to something I had not mentioned explicitly, and that was the appendage on some of the figures that clearly indicated they were male. I can see why some people would find this aspect of the artwork amusing and worthy of note, but of little more interest than that. At first glance, we might imagine the inclusion of a phallus on the figures was meant only to convey their masculine versus feminine nature. But actually, this was a design choice for the artists of the Nordic Bronze Age across different regions for centuries. They took the time to tap out these male appendages with as much care and attention as they gave to the limbs, weapons and heads of their figures, if not more. And not all the figures are depicted with a phallus. One study that analysed 500 figures found that 39% were depicted with one. So does that mean that all the other figures were female? If not, what exactly were the carvers intending to convey to their audience by its inclusion or absence? A question about these petroglyphs more broadly is, how much of what is depicted shows real events and real individual people, and how much is meant to convey mythological stories or metaphorical concepts? To what extent does the art depict reality? Is it possible that these ancient warriors conducted rites and even went to war naked? We assume, of course, that they could not have been in a state of tumescence when they did so, and so we must conclude that the state of arousal is a metaphorical, symbolic depiction or artistic convention. The limited detail allowed by the rocky medium, meaning that the member would not be visible to the audience otherwise. But actually, is that assumption correct? Ethnographic accounts from Polynesia, for example, suggest that displaying your tumescent manhood to the enemy might have been an actual practice after all. I think these are interesting questions to address in themselves, but also exploring this subject can provide insights into this ancient culture and help us to better understand the nature of masculinity and warfare in the societies of the Nordic Bronze Age. Before I go on, I must say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters and channel members for making this video possible. If you like this sort of video, then please help to support my work by joining us on Patreon or YouTube, and you'll get early access to ad-free videos and exclusive content. You can also message me directly to ask questions and suggest future video topics. Your financial support means I can continue to make the kind of content you want to watch. If you can help, please click the links in the video description to find out more. Thank you. The Nordic Bronze Age is a period of Scandinavian prehistory from about 1750 to 500 BC. As far as the rock art is concerned, there are huge numbers of images, usually tapped into flattish boulder surfaces that experts refer to as panels. These panels have a range of image types, but some are more common than others. There are over 20,000 boats, 7,000 animals, and 5,000 anthropomorphic figures, and more than 500,000 cup marks, circular bowl shapes. And these images tell us about the lifestyles, beliefs, and practices of the people who carved them. Just by the sheer number of boats depicted, we can be pretty sure they were highly interested in travelling on the sea. And the figures holding aloft weapons suggest this was a society dominated by maritime warriors. Or at least the subset of the society who carved many of these images, usually in coastal regions, were interested in these things and in this way of life. The carvers and those who were to view the designs may well have been men who undertook journeys by boat to foreign lands near and far. These men would have been involved in trade and social relationships, engaging in diplomacy and arranging marriages and so on, but also in piracy and raiding, and at times perhaps more organised, larger scale forms of warfare. The extent to which what we're seeing reflects real life is debated. It seems likely that many panels depict the start and end of journeys, and the rites involved with preparing for and returning from dangerous ventures. Some researchers have linked depictions of objects with real-life counterparts known from the archaeological record, types of swords, spearheads, and shields, for example. They can even detect where older style weapons are updated by later generations as images are recarved with the shapes of new spearhead designs. And researchers have even analysed the depictions of boats to discover that the people of southern Scandinavia built vessels with masts and yards and rigging and sails as long ago as 1550 BC. By counting the number of crewmen depicted on images and comparing them to ship-shaped monuments on land, they know that these vessels could be as much as 42 metres long. That's over 130 feet. We know from analysing artefacts that these people traded with the British Isles and even perhaps undertook journeys along the Atlantic coasts as far as Galicia. And with boats like this, such journeys don't seem so implausible. Other scenes are perhaps more obviously mythological in nature. Perhaps they depict or reflect real-world rituals to do with the sun and special times of the year, hence the common depictions of domesticated animals and carts. Rituals in many cultures around the world can involve people acting out mythological narratives, so scenes like this could reflect both stories and real events. Depictions of large circles can be both wheels and suns at the same time. A real animal could have pulled a cultic wagon in the real world, in a ritual that recreated the daily procession of the sun being drawn across the sky by horses or oxen or deer. The sexual union of two gods in a sacred marriage could be recreated by a man and woman on Earth. Some massive figures are usually interpreted as gods, or perhaps heroes. Maybe there are multiple depictions of the same massive spear god, for example. Or maybe large figures represent especially famed chiefs, great ancestors who loom larger than life in the collective narrative histories of their descendants. And as you may have noticed, many of the figures holding weapons sport a prominent phallus. A few of them also include testicles. Interpretations of the meanings of the phalluses have varied. A traditional interpretation of many of the scenes was that they were related to fertility rites. The animals, wheels and suns, the apparent community gatherings and so on called to mind agricultural scenes, and the phalluses seem to emphasise the physical act of reproduction. It's worth noting that phallic imagery appears in art from all around the world throughout history, conveying a range of meanings, but fertility, unsurprisingly, is a common one. The Greek god Priapus, for example, with his obscenely oversized phallus in a state of permanent tumescence, was a god of fertility, vegetables, nature, livestock, fruit, beekeeping and gardens. as well as sex, male genitals, and masculinity. So the Nordic Bronze Age depictions could certainly relate to fertility in a general sense, as symbols of the fertility of the earth, and of male fertility specifically. Others interpreted the phallus as merely identifying the figures that were male, meaning those without should be regarded as female. This may well be part of the explanation, but it seems to be more complicated than that. There are other features that identify females, like long hair and perhaps cup marks positioned between the legs. One study found that none of the 20 examined figures with long hair had a phallus, weapons, scabbards or shields, strongly suggesting that they are in fact women. And there are simple figures, like the paddling boat crews, who are depicted as anonymous, identical masses. They are surely the lower classes of men, whose names and deeds were not worthy of note. There is a clear association of phallus figures with weaponry. One study found that axes and swords especially were highly associated with phallic figures. 71% of the figures with axes had a phallus, and 1 in every 5 phallic figures had an axe. And 61% of phallus figures in the study wore swords at their sides. In contrast, only 33% of all figures without weapons were phallic. What we might be seeing here is some degree of class and/or age differentiation in the males depicted. Perhaps the phallus was reserved for depictions of the adult men of the warrior classes, those men buried beneath the tens of thousands of barrows across southern Scandinavia, those who were the heads of their household, old enough and wealthy enough to marry and to father offspring. Those free adult men of the tribe or clan, those who had a lineage, a bloodline inherited from their fathers and passed on through their sons, the phallus being the medium through which that lineage passed down through the generations. Maybe males with weapons but no phallus were youths joining the raids but who were not yet of the age to be considered fully male. It seems clear then that the phalluses had some symbolic meanings for the Bronze Age carvers and their audience. But is there any chance they had a literal meaning too? Did these warriors fight naked? And it seems incredibly unlikely, but could they have possibly done so in a state of physical arousal? We know that the people of the Nordic Bronze Age wore clothes most of the time. This was a pretty sophisticated society, and we have a very good idea of what the upper classes wore, for the span of a few centuries at least, because of the handful of oak coffin burials that preserved organic material like clothes. Elite men probably wore woolen tunics and cloaks, and cosy warm hats. These would have been great to wear on long journeys by boat, and they perhaps wore them when they fought their enemies at the other end too. And the chiefs, at least, probably had metal armour as well. There are bronze shields and bronze helmets known from the Nordic Bronze Age, and bronze breastplates and greaves are known from contemporary Central Europe. Almost no Bronze Age armour survives from anywhere in Europe, but from what we know, it's a good bet that the wealthiest warriors of the north went into battle protected by metal armour. Please watch my videos on Bronze Age clothing, hairstyles and armour for more details about all of this. Many of the images may well depict rites undertaken before or after journeys or battle, in which case the men's nakedness could have been an important part of the ritual. Maybe they stripped off their ordinary clothes and put on special clothing and armour for fighting. Generally speaking, all warriors throughout history have gone into battle wearing as much practical protection as they could afford, although there are some famous exceptions. The historian Polybius writes about Celtic mercenaries fighting naked against the Romans in 225 BC. He believes this was for practical purposes, so their clothes wouldn't catch on the undergrowth. Perhaps Nordic Bronze Age maritime warriors stripped off their clothing to fight from their ships, so that their waterlogged woolen outfits wouldn't pull them under if they fell into the sea. But there are other, less practical reasons for fighting without clothing. In Livy's History of Rome, he talks of Galatians fighting naked, and says the reason is their bared skin makes their wounds more visible, and the deeper the wounds they suffer, the more glory they win in the battle. There are other stories of warriors fighting naked, from Picts to Viking berserkers and so on, and the idea perhaps was to throw oneself entirely into the hands of the gods, to fate, to expose oneself to the greatest possible danger, and thus to win even greater glory in turn. Perhaps it was a kind of worship or devotion to put yourself into such a state, stripped bare of every comfort and every civilizing affectation, leaving just your skill and the will of the gods. A kind of ultimate freedom and test. And such displays of courage may have unmanned the enemy. But of course, it goes without saying that naked men on the battlefield could not have been erect. In stressful situations, our bodies go into a physiological state known as the fight or flight response, where our nervous system automatically responds to life or death situations by releasing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, increasing blood pressure and heart rate, dilating our pupils and so on. Our normal processes like digestion and the desire for mating are put on hold so that we can take quick actions to save our life. One of the effects is to draw blood away from the genitals, and in many ways it's kind of an opposite state to sexual arousal. And yet, there are reports of men experiencing involuntary erections in stressful situations when they are feeling highly aggressive or in physical danger. This kind of thing isn't often talked about openly because it's private and embarrassing. But there are cases where professional boxers and MMA fighters experience this kind of thing during face-offs. Famously, this has happened to former UFC champion Conor McGregor on multiple occasions. And former heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson talked on the Joe Rogan podcast about feeling so much aggression towards his opponents that he could become physically aroused. It's not just professional sportsmen either. Soldiers have experienced involuntary erections during the heightened aggression and fear of combat. I believe the terms battle boner and fear boner describing this phenomenon originated from US forces in the Vietnam War. There are also reports of this happening in near-death experiences. It's likely that surges of various hormones like testosterone released during these emotional events cause the involuntary arousal. Of course, these physiological responses would surely be as rare and unusual back then as they are now. Therefore, they would be unlikely to feature so widely in the Bronze Age rock art. However, I began to see these depictions in a new light after I read a wonderful article called Sex and War in Ancient Polynesia by Professor Michael Reilly. In it, he recounts histories told in the 19th century by two Maori men about their famous warrior ancestors and their penises. The first account tells of a warrior before a battle displaying his erect penis to the ranks of the enemy forces arrayed before him. Maori warfare often began with these displays and boasting, followed by the single combat of champions in front of both forces, finishing with the battle itself. This story tells of the hero stepping out in front of his own ranks, where he whips off his loincloth to display what he calls his weapon, his stick, and invites the enemy to stab it. He issues a bold challenge. If they are successful, then they will live, but if they fail, then he will kill them. The enemy champion tries and fails to win their single combat. As Reilly explains, quote, "Among New Zealand's Maori, erect penises were considered favourable signs and were closely associated with warriors and fighting." End quote. He also says, quote, "There was a linkage between a warrior's phallus and his fighting weapons, notably his long spear." End quote. Another tale in this article was told by a family known as the descendants of Taki Taki Longpenis, after their famous heroic warrior ancestor. His fort was attacked one morning and, quote, "Take Take came out naked and stood on the defensive earthwork where he could be seen by the attackers. In his hands he held his erect penis. The Maori in general seem to have recognised an erect penis as a sign of courage, and the sight of Taki Taki's penis so filled the enemy with admiration that they withheld the attack for a while." End quote. The hero's bold stratagem enabled the defenders to counterattack and win the battle. This kind of display was a common practice among the Maori. An erection was used to show warlike feelings. It was regarded as the symbol of virility and courage, and a sign of being in the favour of the gods. So, quote, "A male leader's self-definition as a brave or daring warrior could be publicly manifested by the confident and provocative display of his erect penis before his peers during battle. Such an act testified to the displayer's superiority over others, and thereby served to confirm military success." End quote. Now, just because this was true for Polynesian warriors, it does not mean it's true for Nordic Bronze Age warriors thousands of years earlier on the other side of the world. But in some ways, these were rather similar maritime warrior societies, and it seems likely, to me at least, that the artworks of ancient Scandinavia could convey a similar cultural relationship between the erect penis and weapons and warfare for the warriors of the Nordic Bronze Age over 3,000 years ago. There's so much more to be said on this subject. There are many other interpretations, and I didn't even mention the phallic knee motif or the associations of phalluses with animals, especially snakes, for what might be obvious reasons. As always, the sources are listed in the description if you'd like to read more for yourself. Now, I have multiple videos about the Nordic Bronze Age that you'll enjoy, but please watch this one on the nature of masculinity and beauty in Bronze Age Europe. Thank you for watching.